In today's tutorial, we're going to learn how to create this particular iridescent material that changes color based on how you're looking at it. It's really simple to do and can be applied to any object to get really amazing results. To start off, I've already created a scene with Suzanne, our default monkey, and also a pawn from a chess piece, just to allow us to create the materials faster. So the first thing I'm going to do is select our pawn and add in a new material, and we're going to name this as Iridescence. And to actually see what the material looks like, we're going to use the look dev mode to see all of the changes. The reason why we're using this is because it already comes with an HDRI, which just makes this look a lot better. So the first thing that we want to do is search for a noise texture and place that into the scene and plug it up with the base color of the principled BSDF. So immediately, you should be able to see a very slight amount of color added into this particular object. We immediately notice that firstly, it's way too light, and secondly, the object itself is far too bright for it to be seen. So the first thing that we have to do is add in a hue saturation mode so that we can actually saturate it even more. So we can take the saturation and make it something like 2.5, and there you can finally see the colors popping out much more prominently. After that, we have to make this a lot darker because it's a dark metal. So we're going to take the value and reduce that to something like 0.1, and immediately it becomes a nice grayish color. However, it's still reflecting too much light from the scene. So we're going to go ahead and increase the metallic because it is a metallic shader that we're creating, and just reduce the roughness quite a bit. And making the roughness something like 0.2 creates the material that we're looking for. Another thing that you can do is go ahead and just reduce the specular of your iridescence material, and that gives another look which you might like, as it just darkens everything a bit because it prevents specular reflections off the material. So a lot of those settings are completely up to your own personal preference. However, this is not really iridescent because irrespective of how you're looking at it, the actual colors don't seem to change its location. So this area is a bit pinkish, this is bluish. No matter how you look at it, the area remains bluish and that area remains pinkish. So we have to get that to change. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and press Ctrl T with our noise texture selected, assuming you have Node Wrangler switched on, to get the mapping and texture coordinate nodes. You can always add those in separately if you don't have the Node Wrangler switched on. And from the texture coordinates, instead of generated, we're going to plug in the camera into the vector. The moment you do this, you'll notice that if you actually rotate, it's going to start moving with respect to the object. Now, the problem is that it's far too small, so we're going to have to play around with the scale. So we can take the scale on the mapping node and change that to something like 0.2, and immediately we get something much better, which is changing as we move our camera along. Now, the thing is that it looks really good when we turn or rotate our camera, but if we actually take the object and move the object, it looks like the colors are sticking onto that particular area of the screen, and it's like a texture or an overlay that's just been added to the video. In order to get rid of that effect, which I can actually show a bit better by adding in a cube and linking it with the same material, you can see that if we actually grab the cube and move it, it looks like it's just an overlay that was applied on top of the cube, and the cube is moving, but the texture is not. Hopefully you can see that, and that made it a lot clearer. So that's something that we want to prevent. So in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and duplicate this texture coordinate and mapping nodes by pressing Shift D and bringing it down here. And instead of using the camera coordinates, this time we're going to use the object coordinates. And now, before we actually plug this into the noise texture, we'll go ahead and search for a vector math node and just place it in right over here. And along with that, take the vector from the bottom mapping node and plug that into the second socket of the vector math node. So now when you actually take the object and move it, you'll see that the texture actually changes and it looks a lot more like an iridescent material and not like it's just an overlay applied to our video. So the same thing, if we move around, because the camera coordinates are also involved, the textures still do change. However, if you feel like this is a bit too small, you can now play with the scale on the actual noise texture and reduce that to give it more of a look that you want. So once you're happy with what it looks like, you can go ahead and remove the cube and just look at what it looks like on your actual material. Now, this is mostly it for the tutorial. You can always see what it looks like on other materials. So we have our Suzanne here. We can just shift click the pawn and press Ctrl L to link materials. And now we have the same material added to the Suzanne, and it just changes quite a bit. However, you'll realize that any metallic objects look much better in Eevee when you have an HDRI available. Now, a few things just to make it look better is to switch on screen space reflections in your render tabs and add in multiple different lights in your scene in order to get it to look good. However, if you don't want to add in multiple lights or you're unable to do that, use an HDRI. So if you actually look at what this looks like in the rendered viewport, it's looking really dark because if we change from object to world in our shader editor, we can see that we just have a background as a really dark gray. And if we lighten it up, this is what we currently have. This is how it looks like with just a single lamp source and the world set to gray. And I think this is fairly good enough, but to actually get the full effect of the metallic chrome, we can always press Shift A, environment texture, and add that in, and choose any HDRI that you get from Polyhaven or any other source, and just plug that into the color. So once you do that, you can see much better reflections in our chrome materials or metallic materials, and that just makes it look a lot better. Similarly, in case you don't like the colors that are currently being applied on your materials just by the noise texture, you can always go ahead and just change the hue value in your hue saturation node, and you'll see you'll get a different selection of colors. So you should be able to choose something that you like better using this particular technique. If you do want complete custom colors, you could add in a color ramp node, but to get true iridescent material-like substances, the randomness from the noise texture is generally one of the best choices that you can go for. If you want to know how I've made this background remain black and the HDRI not be seen, comment down below and I'll create a lot more tutorials explaining these different techniques and how to use the light path node and things like that. If you have any other questions or queries, comment them down below and I'll be sure to respond to all of them. There's a lot more coming up, so until next time, stay tuned and don't forget to stay creative.